What's up, everybody? My name is Michelle. Welcome back to Street Theology. We are so excited to have you guys with us. We are in a special series for Mental Health Meets the Streets for Mental Health Awareness. So this is episode 2, and we've got a super special guest this time. We had the opportunity to interview Dr. Mike Zoda, and he is a super well-known therapist here in Tallahassee, but as well, he's added so much value here at Engage. Plus, he's also a genius. So we're really excited for you to tune into what he has to say. Make sure that you favorite and star this message. You're going to want to refer back to it. Excited for you guys to take a listen.
Hey, what's up, guys? I want to welcome you back to another episode of Street Theology. This is your boy, Pastor Adrian here. I am joined today by our expressions architect, Michelle Warner. Michelle, what's happening?
Hello, everybody.
Good to see you today. And we're also joined today by a guy, he makes rare occasions and rare appearances, you know what I'm saying? The Great White Hope, Trey. Trey, what's happening, man?
Great White Hope, a.k.a. token white guy.
Token
so we
white
don't get
guy,
fined.
there it is. There we go. You know what I'm saying? Try to keep you around to keep myself protected. But no, I'm joking. I'm joking before I get fired. And we're really excited. In a second, we're going to be introducing our special guest for you guys. Again, if you guys are watching on YouTube, you already see our special guest. We're announcing if you're listening podcast, you got greater suspense, all right, if you're listening. So, guys, we're so excited. Here at Street Theology, it really just simply is this. We exist to bring theology to a street level, helping you be an innovative reconciler where space and place you find yourself, helping give wisdom on deep, again, theological things to actually very practical everyday things. And so we are really excited. Again, episode 35 of Street Theology. And so I want to encourage you guys, again, for you guys who are listening, make sure you get signed up. Assist Intensive coming up. If you've been if you're a part of our engaged community, we know we have people, plenty of people who are not even in our engaged community who listen to Street Theology. But if you're a part, man, you've been following us in our series called Seasons. We have our Assist Intensive coming up at the end of the month of May. Make sure you get signed up for there as well. Get signed up for the Nehemiah Institute. Is going down our summer class. Again, this is the second one that we're having. So we're super excited about that as well. So that being said, man, we are excited to introduce our special guest today, someone who has made a huge impact in all of our lives, very specifically Trey, because it's Trey's dad. And so, but we are introduced by the one and only Dr. Mike Zoda. Many of you guys who, whether it's Street Theology or any other podcast I listen to, you hear me randomly or more than randomly talk about this guy named Dr. Mike Zoda. Again, we call him Zoda, the God, lowercase g, you know what I mean? Or we call him Yoda. He kind of just knows how to, like Yoda just waves his hand and just manipulates your whole childhood and brings you back up and helps you become healthy. And so, but Dr. Mike, again, he is someone who at Engage serves as an elder, someone who has been near and dear to me. As many of you guys have heard, I tell people that I would not be alive today if it was not for Dr. Zoda. And so, Doc, we are so glad that you were here on Street Theology.
I'm happy to be here.
Well, we're going to jump right in. And so, again, Doc, this podcast today is really about self-awareness, right? That's something that's talked about a lot. Something that's communicated a lot. But sometimes, again, in today's world, like everything, like definitions and terms have become real fluid, right? It's just kind of whatever, how we're feeling, whatever. And so before we get started, can you actually define for us what is self-awareness?
The simplest way to say that is a conscious understanding and awareness of why you're doing what you're doing. So in general, the more self-aware you are, the more in any moment on big decisions, on small decisions, you'll know why you're doing it.
Wow. That's very succinct, Doc. That's a good job right there. That's a good job right there.
So I know just in general, knowing a little bit of your background story, you said that you weren't always self-aware.
That's an incredible understatement.
Can you give us a little bit of your story, how you ended up in this field, what your journey of self-awareness looked like?
Later 20s, I'm finishing a PhD in chemistry. I was into a first year of a marriage, and I had this deep awareness that I really didn't know why I was studying chemistry. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do in the field with a PhD, and I wasn't sure why I was married to who I was married. And that was a pretty substantial crisis. And I ended up in my own personal therapy. And so I was there for a year and a half before I realized the sensation I had was the word anger. I wasn't ever angry, but that's the degree of lack of self-awareness I had. As I continued to kind of pursue that experience, I realized my passion was more people than molecules. By the time that I'd reached there, the marriage had already ended, and I decided to make a transition into a PhD in marriage and family therapy. Mostly I was planning on being an academic, so I had a lot more interest in the study of the field. Just before I finished that second dissertation, I had a very dramatic conversion experience that totally was another very re-altering of my life. Graduated and ended up staying in Tallahassee in 1988 in private practice. So those are probably two real critical marker points when I started therapy, with this awareness that, the three biggest decisions I say people make is, who's Jesus? What are you going to do? And who are you going to marry? And those are all deep fundamental questions of the heart, or the right side of the brain. And the left side of the brain is where conscious awareness is. So if your head isn't connected to your heart, then you won't know why you're doing what you're doing. And so to have this an awareness in my late 20s that I didn't have any idea how I made the two of the three biggest questions in my life, that was the start of an awareness that I had a problem.
Yeah.
So I feel like I have a little bit of an unfair advantage here, because obviously I've had a more one-on-one relationship with you than many people have. In fact, you've played a pretty big part in those three decisions you just talked about, and shaping those and helping me figure that out. So just as we kind of talk about this topic of emotional healing overall, it sounds like you were saying that self-awareness really is kind of a starting point in emotional healing. So could you just kind of describe how self-awareness becomes a starting point, and then B, how that plays into emotional healing overall?
And first, I want to say I'm proud of you. I think at this point in life, you're doing much better than I was.
Hey, there we go. Gold star.
I need a little bit of encouragement, so I appreciate that.
That's a good thing. Of course, the bar was kind of low, but
Oh,
you're definitely well above my marks.
God.
Yeah.
Beat them up and build them back up.
There we go.
He's been around me a long time.
The
I appreciate
combo.
that, Doc. Good job. Good job. Good job.
And that's kind of baby boomer too. That's about as good as it got. How do you work on self-awareness? It's human beings have a ability to have a sense of relational awareness dynamics, and the more that, usually through your childhood experience, that you focus on other people instead of yourself, then you have to start to train yourself to pay more attention to what's going on the inside than the outside. Now, for some people, they have trouble with pushing that awareness down into their hearts. Other people, they're so aware they don't know how to manage it. So there's some different ideas around that. If the actual starting point question is, if you don't have self-awareness, how do you start? You want to start by just trying to notice that you have emotions. And then you want to start thinking about emotions like colors, where there's primary colors and there's mixtures, shades, and hues. Primary emotions will be things like anger, guilt, shame, sadness, fear. And you want to start noticing, when do you have a feeling and what's the feeling connected to? So a useful way to think about it is, something happens. It could be outside, it could be an interaction, a behavior, it could be inside, it could be a thought. But there's emotions that are connected to the behaviors or the thoughts. And so you want to keep working on these questions of what happened. I call that the trigger. How do you feel? Pick the emotion. And then why do you feel that way? And I call that the meaning. So the what happened is usually a sentence or two. When you said this, when I thought this, when this happened. Feelings are usually a word or two. I was angry, I was hurt, I was afraid. And then the meaning is usually a couple paragraphs. Example, we're supposed to meet if we're supposed to have lunch at 12, and I'm at the restaurant and it's 12:15. And then you come in at 12:20. And then I notice, I'm feeling kind of angry. Why do I feel angry? Well, because it's 20 minutes later, and probably for that 20 minutes, I'm getting worried if something happened. And now I know that you're just late, not anything happened. And so now I'm a little hurt and mad because I feel like whatever kept you late was more important to you than me. Now, none of that may be accurate, but that would just be an unpacking of trigger, feeling, meaning.
Mhm.
And so being able to, as a starting point, and the harder it is to notice your feelings and what they're connected to, you may have to start more with the feeling first, then the trigger. So you have to backtrack it. If you're pretty unaware of that, the more aware you get, the more you'll know what the trigger was. But that's a starting point if you're coming from the very unaware place.
Right.
Let me ask you this: why, Doc? Why do you think people don't have this as a starting point? Why isn't self-awareness a starting point? It's so critical, but why isn't that a starting point?
Yeah, I've got a metaphor for everything. So, real quick story: there's been 2 times in my life I've lived in a house with a guinea pig, and these guinea pigs, both times with no human involvement, they're herbivores. They understood that what they liked was in the refrigerator. And both these guinea pigs learned to squeak when they heard the refrigerator door close. So what I'm going to say is this is even greater than human beings. It's either greater than mammals. So we're down into pea-brain rodents. They have a voice, and they let you know what they want. Mm-hmm. So the starting point, just to further build your question, is I think it's such an innate part of life to say, here I am, and this is what I want. Newborn babies come out doing that.
Yeah.
So anytime, let's finish the guinea pig analogy. Guinea pigs in the wild don't squeak, because if you're a guinea pig in the wild and you squeak, you are food, you don't get food. Mm-hmm. So it's almost always environmental that teaches us to lose our voice.
Wow.
And how that can happen can be complex, but it can be even as simple as a child, and it can start in infancy. You learn, it's behavioral, that if you express yourself and there's no positive response, if it's a negative response or none at all, that will be punishing enough for you to progressively and fairly rapidly lose your voice. And so this is going to happen at a point where you don't even have the cognitive understanding of a voice in the first place. But for a lot of people, it's already learned before they even have the capacity to understand what's going on. So it's almost always, there can be biochemical, genetic things, autism, there's always some brain physiology that could be, but the vast majority of the time, if you lost your voice, it's because something environmental happened, because it's such an innate part of life to say, here I am, and this is what I want.
Well.
Gosh. I have like 85.
I know.
I guess, okay, so I think that is part of what some of the barriers to growing in self-awareness or being self-aware in general could be, is losing your voice. Mm-hmm. Does that usually come, can that come from any experience? Does it usually come from trauma? What are the main things that keep people from being self-aware in your experience?
If we use real broad definitions like abuse, neglect, in more spiritual terms, abuse would be the sin of commission. So those are wrong things done. Abuse is the sin of omission, the right thing that's not done. So it'd be a combination of both. If it's an environment where literally nothing bad happened, but there was no positive response to a voice, that'll cause you to lose your voice. If you think about a time where you have something important to say and you say it to somebody and they don't say anything negative, they literally say nothing. Yeah. That no response actually will make you stop talking. It doesn't always have to be something that's directly felt hurtful. The lack of the response is hurtful enough for people to stop.
So thinking about that idea of saying something and not getting a response from it, and due to kind of the nature of this podcast, trying to bring theology down to the street level, being involved in church for the past 30 plus years, and also being a therapist during that time, serving as an elder, would you say that you have bumped into, again, kind of a two-sided question? One, just hesitancy from people within the church body in addressing their mental health. And then two, do you feel like there have been ways that the church has been silent when there have been concerns that have been brought up, or ways that, emotional health has been mishandled overall?
Yes.
Yeah. There you go.
Some of that has really shifted. One of the things it's not a lot of good things about getting older, but you get a different view. So I've got 30 years of looking at sort of mental health in church. And I think certainly in starting, there was a lot more of a pushback against mental health, psychology, particularly in the church setting. There was already some amount of pushback just from the cultural dynamics of being a baby boomer, the idea of emotionality and dealing with how you felt. I think, when you look at it generationally, boomers' parents, the great generation that grew up in a depression, a lot of the men were served in World War II. That was a generation that was pretty unself-aware. And those were the parents. So if your parents don't teach you this, so just going on a tangent. The answer is yeah. Culturally, there's been some real shifts in that. I think there was a lot more of a struggle in the 80s, 90s that shifted a lot. I still think that there's times where in the excesses of culture, selfish, sometimes words like self-actualization or authenticity, that's why it's always careful to name it, can be seen by the church as words for being selfish or justifying things that the Bible doesn't teach. So I still think there's some amount of typical bias and pushback, but it has more to do with the fears the church has at the excesses of culture than I think these ideas not actually being biblical, especially when you're careful how you define them.
Yeah. And I think, so with that, let's stay there because, me and you have so many conversations about this. That's why I tell people all the time, I wish most of the times that people could follow us around with the camera. Just because again, we just start talking about stuff and we just in some of the conversations, but one of the things me and you have been talking about that a lot lately is that, and so I want you to kind of dive into it, this idea though, that how anxiety, right? Even though we're talking about how anxiety is currently even driving the church and God's people in this moment. I kind of tell people anxiety is that thing you don't really see. I always give the analogy of playing at Duke. When you're playing Cameron Indoor Arena, you're in there and it's like, why am I playing so fast? I don't understand why I'm playing so fast, but I watched myself on camera and I was like I looked like a crazy person playing. I never played that fast. It's because it's it pushes you something and it's and it speeds you up. And I think, we've talked about a lot. That's one of the biggest issues right now in the church space is this anxiety. But actually, when you try to even bring it up to people, they won't even hear you because they have more anxiety. So it's just you're like, I'm like, dude, this is the biggest waste of time. And so sometimes it can get hopeless. So talk more about how anxiety drives, what you said, it drives people to define terms or not want to lean into terms or try to reject all these things that sometimes I think we're rejecting stuff that if we actually leaned into it, we actually could help it. So yeah, kind of unpack that a little bit.
I think that in general, fear kind of prefaces anxiety, and they can be synonymous or a little bit different. Fear and shame are the enemies of our soul. And that since Genesis 3, fear and shame to some degree rule the human heart. And so it's so ubiquitous, it's water into the fish in the fish tank that you don't really notice it. Particularly with anxiety, if we look at it more physiologically, you don't notice it until the anxiety is high enough, you start having physiological responses. So a panic attack is a full-blown physiological negative feedback loop around anxiety. But when the anxiety isn't nearly as powerful, ultimately fear anxiety pushes fight or flight. And so the sort of softer forms of fight or flight, fight part would be things like obsessing. So obsessive compulsive disorder is an anxiety disorder. So as your anxiety starts going up about a possible conflict, it could be with a spouse, it could be at a societal level or anything in between. If you're moving more out of the fight parts of anxiety, you'll tend to start to think about it more. And when you start thinking about it in loops, which is what obsessing is, the problem isn't your thinking, the problem is your feeling. So a lot of arguments that get overly pushed into black and white arguments, black and white thinking is characteristic of anxiety-driven thinking. Because emotions, we tend to experience them more like, I'm anxious, I'm not anxious. I'm sad, I'm not sad. We experience emotions more black and white. Adult thinking is more abstract, and it's more able to hold the grays. But the more, no matter how cognitively intelligent you are, the more anxiety starts to capture your thinking, the more your thinking will be characterized by more black or white or some of these more absolutes. At that point in time, the person may not call that anxiety, but that actually is a sign that the anxiety is now actually overwhelming cognition in a way that their thinking is driven into those black and whites.
Wow.
If you come at it from more the flight perspective, then there's just an avoidance, either internally, I don't want to think about it, or I know my position, I know your position, but we're in a different position, so I don't want to talk about it with you. That's that idea of fight or flight. But a lot more of these arguments, I think we're seeing even at the cultural level, are coming more out of how anxious people are.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
And so I know something that Pastor Adrian has been talking about recently is doing life in the gray, and what it looks like to have the unknown things, and just knowing that there's a lot of anxiety in culture and in the church, and then things speeding you up or slowing you down, people walking away from faith. What does it look like for people to, I guess, understand and manage their anxiety in family, and just even practice and do self-awareness as a unique and differentiated person, but also in family?
So just to connect back to that other question, remember, if it's speeding you up, it's moving you towards the fight part. You're trying to kind of internally somehow manage. If it's moving you towards the slowing you down, it's moving you towards the flight part. So those are how soft some of the fight or flight, because normally you think about that in extreme cases of literally, physically fighting or running away. But in the softer forms of anxiety, where it's still prevalent, it's still actually impacting your feelings, you'll find it more of the softer ways. That's why I like those words, speed up, because you're trying to manage the anxiety, but that's the fight, or slow, that's the avoidance. So now you asked me a couple questions.
I did. Sorry.
Do one at a time.
Okay. So how we do life in the gray. Do you want to start there?
Yes.
Okay.
and that's going to get us to
list them all again.
Yes, that's going to get us to a question that will probably unpack a little more, and that has to do with emotional resilience. Because it means that you have the awareness, if authenticity is defined as self-awareness and the ability to remain self-aware, which is resilient, it means that you have to have practiced enough managing your anxiety so that in those times that you are anxious, you can manage the anxiety in ways where it actually doesn't manage you. And so a lot of what's going on is people's anxiety is managing them, and they don't have the self-awareness to know that's what's going on with them. So that's why it starts with self-awareness. And one of the things that I always say is that as you sort of do this journey to increasing self-awareness, you should see overall positives in your life. But the one thing that are marker points for progress that human beings don't like is a better understanding what's wrong with you and a deeper experience of the pain of life. So one of the reasons that people get anxious about self-awareness is they'll have a better understanding what's wrong with them. And a lot of what's wrong with them is they're avoiding their pain that they have for a multitude of reasons. So that's why the first starting step is self-awareness. But don't be surprised if you start that journey that the things you start learning are like unpleasant. You say, why am I doing this? Well, because that's what you have to do to answer your first question. It's just difficult.
I want to, so with that, because me and you have, again, like letting these conversations that we have is that you growing up as a baby boomer, right? It's this idea, like, you always say, man, this isn't like feelings, right? You couldn't feel anything. Then you have a generation that's coming right now feels everything.
Yes.
Well, the problem we run into is that, and it's like when I never forget working with you and coming in your office, working with you, doing these things. One of the things that was really interesting was that I got the part really clear of the Bible that I suck, right? Like that was one thing. Like I just knew that. Like, okay, like I suck. Like the world sucks. I suck. I get it. I got that part of the gospel clear. You were different with me because you actually were like, no. I didn't have to question like how bad I was. Like, oh no, you pulled out those things. One of the things I see as a danger, and I'd like for you to speak to this, again, as someone who's well more qualified in this area, is the fact that like, then when you come from a biblical context, there's just parts of life where it's like, yeah, you can't hide behind this. You can't stay there. You can't hide behind it. Like at the end of the day, it's like, I mean, I tell people like, man, the thorn in my flesh of wanting to commit suicide and the thorn in my flesh of depression is there. Hadn't gone anywhere. But at some point in time, how do you actually help, Doc, people move past that? Because there's just a point where you're like, we've created Jesus into like this, like, we talk about like this therapeutic God of like, which he is. He's loving, caring counselor, which again, your generation need to hear.
Right.
Some of Gen X, the generation coming behind, I believe like, yeah, he's loving, But also, like, he's this way, and we think Old Testament. I'm like, no, I think actually when you read the New Testament, because last time I checked, Jesus is coming back with 2 swords, like coming out of his mouth, and he's turning tables, doing that. The idea that, like, he does have an expectation for us to move forward and grow. How do you manage that tension and, like, to help people work through their stuff? And I know I've gone a long way around this, but having the resilience that you gotta get through it.
Yeah.
Like, how do you manage that? Because I think each generation needs one or the other, but this generation that's coming up, it's that part. So how do you actually do that in a healthy way?
So one of the things that you're talking about is the difference on, think about a chiropractor and his spine's out of alignment. Which way do you push?
Yeah.
So boomers may need more push into understanding God's unconditional love. And millennials may need a little more of a push towards understanding God's holiness and justice and this expectation of submission, obedience, lordship, which is a kind of lordship at multiple levels. That's certainly every nation strong teaching.
Yep.
And so I think it starts with literally a cognitive understanding of what the Bible teaches.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that is very common is Bible illiteracy. So people that would say that they're Christian, but really don't know even basic starting points of what the Bible teaches. So,
really good.
So while cognitive understanding in and of itself will do very little for emotional behavioral change, that's a starting point. And then I think as you understand and as you read and as your heart is impacted by the Holy Spirit, because the real hope of the Christian faith, the one miracle that God's always doing in the hearts of his people since Pentecost is changing them from the inside out through the work of his Spirit. So some of it is really understanding that God is real and he actually desires a real relationship with us. So I think these two ideas of first understanding what the Bible is the expression from God to us of who he is.
Yeah.
And if you think about a communication dynamic, when you're talking to somebody, if you're trying to be healthy, you're trying to be honest, and you're hoping they are listening and believing what you're telling them.
Yeah.
So what the Bible is God telling us about himself and asking us to believe him. So if you want a relationship with God, you should read the Bible so you understand who God is. And I think as you understand more who God is, particularly in a relational context, through the work of the Spirit, you'll see that opens the door to the process that Christians have been calling sanctification, which is how we become more like Jesus, which for me starts with that Genesis 3 question you sometimes reference, which is the question God asks Adam and Eve after the fall is, where are you?
Yeah.
So knowing where you are, which is a reflection of self-awareness, then understanding who's asking you, which is the living God, that is a fundamental dynamic, I think, to how people shape their faith. And in that process, you should see more of a conviction to change the behaviors that don't line up with who God is and how he asks us to respond.
Yeah, and that's really good. One of the things I've been thinking about this idea, and I'm going to Trey as a question, is that it is becoming biblically, it's like not being biblically illiterate. I also think some of it too is that for leaders and pastors, and again, a lot of really good ones out there. But one of the things I've come to in this social media driven world where everyone hears, I've come to realize I have to fight this a lot, where you actually preach to a crowd that isn't your people. Like you're preaching to a people who aren't yours. Like what's really interesting, a lot of people who make these strong stances about certain things, those people aren't your church. So here's a great example. People railing against critical race theory in the Southern Baptist Church. Most of the people that's in your church, they're on your team, fam. You actually need to be asking them why are you are you racist? Matter of fact, you actually probably not the results of critical race theory, not the way, we talk about the solutions, but maybe to determine what's going on. There are things where I think we just preach, and I find myself, again, because I do stuff bigger than outside of engage, I have to be careful to make sure I am pushing in to what actually people in our church do. And that's what I find really interesting, even pastors and leaders, as anxiety drives, we are preaching and pushing out of our anxiety. That's biblical truth, but not maybe biblical truth for the people you lead. The one thing I feel like in the age that is to come, it is, I think in our current moment we're living in right now. Why? And I wanted to say this because of all the stuff we're dealing with right now in this current moment, what we're talking about of self-awareness, is because I think that what's starting to happen from a church standpoint, a Jesus follower standpoint, is what God's really wanting people to shrink. So listen, I'm not responsible for pastoring the entire world. I'm not. Mm-hmm. I'm responsible for engage and those surrounding the vortex. And again, that's multiple people from different age, demographics, whatever. But also, I've got to make sure I'm doing that. And I think it's very important for people who are listening to make sure that your friends that you're around and people you're talking to, are you just railing against stuff that's pushing against you, or actually stuff that's helpful for people? Because, what I'm saying? Because that's the most important part. Are we actually helping people, or are we just pushing? And many times we're saying you're not self-aware. You don't realize what's driving you. So a lot of times you're preaching the gospel, but you're only preaching one part of the gospel. I tell people, most of us, again, I heard my good friend Clayton Bell say it the other day, most of us operate way more like Thomas Jefferson does theologically than we want to admit. Or if you don't know anything about Thomas Jefferson, he cuts out parts of the Bible. Yeah. And that's how most of us operate. We just only thought on certain parts of the Bible. No, we would never walk around with it. He literally had a physical Bible that had stuff cut out of it. We don't do that. Our lives just do that. Right. And we just rail on one side. And so I think why this is important, and I'm going to pass this to Trey, is that why I want to pin this is because I want you guys to understand, no matter who you listen, I always tell people, listen to a bunch of people. That's why it didn't freak me out. Listen to everybody. Listen to people. Why? Because you get a different view. But if you just stay in one lane, you're just going to get, and make sure that lane you're staying is pushing against you. Make sure it's challenging you. I don't like, so listen, I am a preacher in nature. I can pull people up. That's why I listen to people who are different than me. I listen to people who challenge me at a different level because it pushes against me. So I wanted to say that. But Trey, what you got, man?
Yeah, I just kind of want to bring it back in, try to I think I have a good kind of summary point here. So just to recap some of what Pastor Adrian said, some of what Dr. Zoda said, is that multiple views and building your self-awareness over time, practicing that is going to help you build resilience. Resilience plus getting this biblical knowledge, understanding who Jesus is, understanding who you're called to be, is going to help you reach a level of spiritual maturation, correct? That's going to keep pushing you down that path. So within that, I feel like we've talked about self-awareness, but could you kind of go into the role of our responsibility with self-control in that?
Self-control is kind of like a muscle, sort of the main muscle of our soul. Just like a muscle, when you exercise it, use good form, and you regularly exercise, it gets stronger. So one of the things in that lifting a weight analogy with self-control is you have to find that place where initially the thing you may be trying to do, you have the capacity to do. So some people may set something out before them that's too much. If you're struggling with eating, then you have this goal about, I'm going to go keto, and you're not able to do it, not in any kind of meaningful way. It's too much to start with. By the same token, if you just sort of think it's a good idea and just keep doing what you're doing, then, definition of insanity, nothing actually will change. So there's sort of a balance, kind of like working out, lifting a weight, that you have to use the weight that challenges you. You use too much and you'll just get discouraged, maybe hurt. Use not enough, or don't go to the gym, you won't get any stronger. So you have to realize it's a process, just like it is a exercise of the soul. So self-control is built through the effort to resist, just like a weight, what it is you want to change over time. The other thing for Christians is that it's an interesting word because it's also one of the fruits of the Spirit. Right. So there's also a very dynamic part of our relationship with God that should increase our self-control through the empowering of the Spirit. But also there's a part of our own free will, which we have, that we have to put to that exercise as well. So if you forget the role of God, you're missing a really important place of strength. If you think it's all going to be God, then you're probably being irresponsible. And
what's interesting that you say that is because I hope you guys, I want to encourage you guys to go back and depending on what platform you're on, hit the back button. Some say 10 seconds, some you have the 45-second jump back, go back and listen to what he just said. Just hit the back button, go back and listen to what he just said again, because I think it's very, very practical. And it's very real. And it's like some of the things I think can help a lot of you, even from some of the emotional turmoil that you're in. When you talk about the idea of self-control, and you just gave that example of keto and things like that. I think, early on in my faith, someone actually helped me. Well, I was a couple years in the faith where like, I was coming out of just a crazy background. And like, but I still just had parts of the old nature that was still there. And I'll never forget, like the person who was pouring into my life was like, hey, well, what were you doing 2 years ago? And I told him. He's like, wow. I was like, okay, well, like, where are you at? And I'm like, oh, I'm here. He's like, do you think that's better? I was like, yeah. He's like, are you where you want to be? It's like, no. He's like, but is it better? He's like, yeah. It's like, do you feel like, when sin patterns happen, do you feel guilt? I mean, do you feel the weight? It says like, yeah, I do. He's like, okay. It's like, you're better. Your spirit of God's in you. Because I think what happens is that what turns a lot of people upside down is like, and it's this tension of where like, it's like, it's what Paul writes. Like, do I keep sinning? No, by no means. Right. Like, but also it's this other side of it though, where you're like, I'm still trying to become this. Mm-hmm. And it's a heart, because always what you get to, it's a heart condition. And so I want to encourage some of you out there that you may be walking through some stuff. You're like, man, like I'm still struggling with things, but like to stop and say, hey, how far have you come? Maybe some of you, no, you need to realize, oh no, I've gone nowhere. Matter of fact, I've gone backwards. And you know what? That's the issue. And you need to repent. There's also some of you that, man, like you've made huge strides, but there's still patterns that are not there. You need to respond to it, but also realize, man, encourage yourself that you've come along. The Spirit of God's working in you. And so does that make, because I think totally. I want you guys to really hear that, because I think it can really save a lot of you in your everyday practical life of progressive sanctification. Because we have, I think, sometimes an unrealistic view of sanctification, where it's like, hey, now there are stories where people get something, man, I never, I was smoking, people, you hear those stories, man, I used to, smoke meth on an airplane. And then all of a sudden it's like, I don't smoke meth ever again. You're like, great. Yeah. Right. But most people like, you're the 1 out of 10, but 9 out of 10, like, you know what? You ain't smoking meth all the time. You know what I'm saying? Again, I'm joking and Jess, so please chill out. But what I am trying to say though, but you're not like, but it's way less, or you're doing, it's way less. And again, that doesn't mean me saying, oh, it's okay to sin, but it's like, I'm just trying to be a realist when it actually comes to the, like, to your walk with God. So I don't know if you want to add more to that.
In general, wisdom's a road, and it's a road that has ditches on either side. So on the idea of becoming more like Jesus, sanctification, the ditches on that is licentiousness and legalism. So when you're into the ditch of legalism, it means that you're judging yourself by the standard of the law. And if you think you're doing well, it'll puff up your pride and self-sufficiency. If you're doing poorly, then you'll have this crushing shame. So that means either way, if you're becoming judgmental and arrogant or crushed by, I'm not good enough, you're probably in the ditch of legalism. If you move into the ditch of licentiousness, which is the idea that, well, Jesus loved me, Jesus my homeboy, he's good with me, I can do what I want, then you're into that ditch of licentiousness. Licentiousness means it's a license to do something wrong. So anyone did watch 007, that they had a license to kill. It's wrong to kill. That's a form of licentiousness. So for a Christian, thinking that because you're saved by Jesus' death on the cross, that allows you to sin, that would be a form of licentiousness, which is actually extremely dishonoring to God. Yeah. So the ditches around this are licentiousness and legalism in sort of a more historical setting. That's how you talk when you're an old guy.
Yeah. But I hope you guys really get that, because I'm telling you, there's just so much bad theology on both sides of this. And that's why I wanted to bring this up, because again, it goes back to self-awareness and anxiety that drives it. Because what do we see? We see some people hold on to the law more. And then and it's funny. It's like these guys, it's really interesting that happens, that in the last, year, we've seen people in completely two different streams of like theologically, whatever, both of these leaders going completely sideways. People who were like, so like this is law, and like railing against stuff, and you're like, oh, you're that way. And people going head first into it, like, hey, like going head first with culture and kind of like, not really holding a standard. They've gone it. So it's like either way you can go, because it still comes back to what is your heart. And I think many times it's like, I know in my life, when you rail and you push so hard against that whole Colin Keller quote, what you know what I'm saying, what you demonize, you idolize. And it's like, because your heart matters. And I want to encourage all of you listening, like, your heart matters. And why we're talking about this, I always want to bring this back, because when people talk about self-awareness and emotionality, like, because we're so detached and don't understand this, we don't realize how important this is when it comes to theologically, when it comes to our walk with Jesus. Because if you don't understand this, you will literally read scripture wrong. You will apply scripture wrong. You will love your neighbor wrong. That's most of the stuff. Because this stuff drives us, it actually, the way we play out our theology, our love for God, it just plays out in really negative ways. And I want to really encourage you guys, why you should be doing this deep work is because it's actually going to make you a better Jesus follower. I can attest to that. I am a way better Jesus follower. Because of self-awareness and resilience and things like that. And so, Doc, as we're kind of coming a little bit to a close, like, you really recently talked about, and I wasn't in there, I'm actually super excited about hearing this, about the values, right? About the idea of our values, the spiritual family, and the idea of authenticity. And you kind of did the most, Zoda thing ever, where you kind of made them all work together. And here's all the stuff that everybody was telling me about. This is the greatest thing ever, right? And I wasn't there. So, appreciate that, Doc. And so, well, anyway, so I can get a little bit of a, kind of the Spark Notes version of that conversation, because those are two values. How do those things connect with self-awareness and all this?
My brain's always boiling things down. So when you really kind of think about human beings' relationship, you have to learn how to be yourself. My favorite verse for that is Proverbs 4:23. Above all else, guard your heart's the wellspring of life. And then you have to learn how to be together. So authenticity flows out of all the things we're talking about in this podcast. And being together is, now how do I relate to you? And my favorite proverb for the being together is Proverbs 3:5-6. Trust the Lord with all your heart, lean not on your own understanding, in all your ways acknowledge him, he'll make your path straight. So we talk about how anxiety speeds things up. So when people are in conflict, because it makes them anxious, they'll try to move to a premature resolution or decision about the conflict. This is all lots of the themes. So being able to be self-aware, to be authentic, have the resiliency to hold your self-awareness in your anxiety and know how to then relate to your neighbor when you have a conflict. And I have a real broad definition of a conflict. It's when you're aware you think, feel, needs, want something different than your neighbor thinks, feels, needs, wants. When human beings have that sense, they will feel anxious. And so we talked about kind of this process for our souls that in some ways can be seen as mirroring the process of human development in the fetus, which is sperm and egg connect, fertilize, and initially there's this proliferation of the same kind of cells, which are called stem cells, and then the cells, so they start to be different from each other, they differentiate, they start becoming the cell that they're coded to be, articulate, and then at birth, they're now integrated into a greater whole, which is the newborn baby. So there's this process at the individual level that can model that cellular development of learning how to sort of be different. Initially, it's from parents, figuring out then not only that I'm different, but who am I? And then out of the sense of who I am, then learning how to relate back into relationships with other people. So that's why these two ideas are so core to human development: be yourself, be together, which is reflected in the spiritual values of authenticity. So this would be the fundamental starting point of how you become more self-aware. And then how do you be together? Well, part of the why to be together is for spiritual family. And then the other core value that will flow out of that is what is the whole point of the Nehemiah Institute, which is then to learn how to be a innovative reconciler. So in order to be an innovative reconciler, you have to have skills around how to be yourself and be together with other people. Spiritual family gives you opportunity to practice.
Yep, it does. And that's really good. And I think it was a great summation of that, because as I hear you say that, it's profound, because as you're trying to learn to be self-aware, you have to learn to work in family. And that's why I believe the church can be such a great model in our world today, because it's either two extremes, right? Either people want to be solo, isolated, or if you're with a group of people, you have to just, whatever I want to be, that's what I am. And I said, that's not actually how you function in a family, right? There's certain things like, no, we want you to have your freedom.
and your individual expression, but also your individual expression can't overtake and become the full identity of an entire family. That's why I try to tell people, with parents raising kids, it's like, if your kids say, say you play sports, you're like, no, like fully invest. And sometimes you got to surround yourself around that, because maybe you have a child who's good at it or whatever, and you want to surround it. But when that thing becomes a full identity of a family, and then that something happens, well, the kids doesn't pan out, or something goes sideways, or, it just, the kid don't want to play anymore. Then it becomes like this crisis of identity for an entire family, because this became the entire identity of a family.
Yes.
And so, but there's also things you do. So it's really important that, I guess, in being in church family, like you said, you get to practice it, you get to do it. And why that's important, because like you said, being an innovative reconcile, as you're able to fully know yourself and also function healthy with people, you actually can go to the world to actually do that for other people in other spaces. You're able to go into whatever your work, you're able to go into your communities, whatever, and actually begin to do the same thing and produce that within the kingdom. That's a kingdom thing. You're able to produce it wherever you find yourself. And I think it's super important. And I think, as we come to a close, Doc, I really appreciate you, we talk a lot. And again, I tell people, like, our church, and not even beyond our church now. I mean, me and you work in a lot of spaces together now. It's like, but really, like, watching, whether it's a corporate world to other parts of churches, to mega churches, whatever, seeing people be impacted by this. It's like, I'll never forget this. It's like, sitting with you in your office, and I'm like, and I've been around a lot of really, really good people. And I'm like, and I'll never forget working. I'm like, this dude's really good. I'm like, he's really, really good. And, what I mean? It's like, so it's impacting me. And I'm like, and I'm usually, and again, and I was working with you, you helped me learn stuff where, like, that I pretty much can put things together pretty fast. I understand it. And now it's been really cool, because it's like, I tell people, like, it's been really awesome, because, you were able to invest those things that help me to be who I am. Like, the things I'm walking in today. And I tell people, they ask me, like, man, like, you talk about this Zoda guy all the time, or man, you do this, Zoda comes with you, he does these things. I'm like, and it's the whole point. I tell him, like, because one, he's really good. I'm like, two, I'm like, I have a skill set and ability to create things that you couldn't have created on your own. It's like, you have a skill set and ability to create something in me I couldn't create on my own. And that is literally what you just said, is that wanting to be in family and self-awareness and that stuff like that. And I tell people all the time, like, Engage Church, like, our church will not have the impact if it wasn't for, like, your life. Your life directly affecting mine, your life directly affecting Trey, you've directly affected Michelle, you've helped be a part of creating this culture. And so I just want to tell you, before we get off, thank you for, like, all your hard work, because I know for 30 years sitting in your office, like, developing this skill set, being for, like, man, does anybody, the whole thing, am I good enough? Am I not good enough? Dealing the same thing over and over again, talking to people many times, you're like, okay, it's like the same story over and over again. And it's like, you just roll it off and do your thing. I want to tell you, we appreciate your sacrifice in doing that, because there's so many other people across the world. And I think in generations upon generations to come, that literally will be transforming change because of the work you did. And so, in the decisions that you made in the beginning of this podcast, the decisions you made to follow Jesus, decisions you made to go into therapy, the decisions that you've made, is going to make a lasting impact for generations. So I just want to tell you, thank you for all your hard work and everything you did. And so, well, guys, hey, we appreciate you. And I want to encourage you guys to take this podcast again, make sure, you write a review about this podcast, but also with this specific podcast, make sure you share it. Make sure you guys start, come back and listen to it, because there are certain things I've learned, like, the older I get in life, I'm starting to get to a place now where I reread things or re-listen to things that made an impact. You're like, oh, it was so good. And then, like, you take a couple things. I go back and I'm learning more and more of the reread. This is one of these podcasts, I believe, that if you constantly go back for the next 10 years of your life, you're always going to pull something else out of it, because it's just constant wisdom that you're going to need. So until next time, guys, we'll be back with you soon on Street Theology.